A wonderful occasion for a wonderful organization, and for all of you who are its strongest supporters. The work that you're doing is incredibly important, and incredibly important at a critical time in security for Israel, and a critical time for the national security of the United States. I was just in Israel last week and ran into Glenn Beck, among other old friends there. I was there with former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar, who undertook last year, a great man, undertook last year to form what he called the Friends of Israel Initiative, a group of European and American leaders who were increasingly worried about threats to the very legitimacy of the State of Israel, not simply criticism on a day-to-day basis of its policies, but criticisms like that Zionism is racism resolution that go right to the very legitimacy of the State of Israel itself. And his recognition of the threat that Israel faces, going beyond the terrible day-to-day threat of terrorist attacks, reflects a profound dilemma for the world as a whole, and a profound challenge to the United States and to the leadership that the United States should be providing around the world. These areas of challenge and threat to Israel come in many different dimensions, but I want to talk about three in particular tonight. The first off, the most current effort to attack Israel's legitimacy. Second, the very grave risk posed by developments in the Middle East and the changes in regimes, that some of which have been friendly with Israel, some of which have not been, but which in the aggregate, I think, threaten a return to the insecurity Israel faced back in the 1950s and 1960s. And then third, the most profound threat of all, the existential threat to Israel of a nuclear Iran, the threat that could bring a nuclear holocaust. Now, let me address the first threat, the challenge to Israel's legitimacy represented by the likely effort of Palestinians and their allies in the United Nations to bring a resolution forward in the General Assembly this fall that will declare a Palestinian state. Now, this effort stems from the view of Palestinian leaders that they're not getting what they want in direct face-to-face negotiations with Israel. You know, if you want to solve conflict in the world, ultimately the parties to the conflict have to resolve it among themselves. It may be difficult, it may be less difficult, but there's no substitute ultimately for the hard decisions that the parties to the conflict themselves have to make. And the Israelis have been ready since the beginning of the Madrid process back in 1991, after the first Persian Gulf War, have been ready any time to sit down in direct negotiations with the Palestinians, with anybody else who's prepared to acknowledge Israel's right to exist, to live in peace and security, and to be free from international terrorism. That's not good enough for the Palestinian Authority. They don't want simply to negotiate with Israel. In fact, they're not even satisfied at this point to have Barack Obama negotiate on their behalf, which is what he's been doing effectively for the past 2.5 years. Instead, the Palestinians want the UN to declare something that is manifestly not true, namely that Palestine is a state. And they will do so almost certainly in a way that tries to define the borders of that state directly contrary to the interest and the security of the people of Israel. Now, this threat is nothing new. The Palestinians declared themselves to be a state in 1988. And do you know how they proved it at the United Nations? This is what I dealt with during my time up there, this kind of activity. They used to sit as an observer on the side of the UN General Assembly, and the sign in front of their desk said, Palestine Liberation Organization. But when they declared themselves to be a state, they changed the name card so that it said Palestine. Well, that makes them a state in the eyes of the UN, or at least that's the argument that they made. And they then set about to create more facts on the ground in the UN system by joining all of the UN's many specialized agencies. They were on the verge in early 1989 of prevailing, of creating the fact on the ground of a Palestinian state, even though at that time the PLO's leadership was in Tunisia. The only thing that stopped them was the decision by then Secretary of State James Baker to announce publicly that the United States, in effect, would cut off any contribution to any UN agency that enhanced the PLO's status. And that threat alone was enough to stop the PLO effort. Now, what they're trying to do today is similar but more troubling because of the boundary issue. Everything that is declared to be within the boundaries of the Palestinian state, by definition, is not going to be within the boundaries of Israel. And this reflects a complete repudiation of the key elements of American foreign policy since the 1967 war, founded on UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338, which called for land for peace, that the parties would work out what the boundaries would be, and in exchange for that, they would commit to live in peace with one another. Now, fundamentally, that's what direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians should be about. And they've had extensive negotiations over the last 20 years. What the Palestinians are now trying to do by going to the General Assembly this fall is change the balance of persuasion within the negotiations. But let's remember, the General Assembly of the United Nations has no authority whatever to declare Palestine a state or anything else. Its resolutions are not binding. And the Palestinians could get a resolution passed that declared that oatmeal cookies were the world's favorite food. There is a built-in anti-Israel, anti-American majority in the General Assembly. So the best way to approach this, while obviously rejecting its conclusions, is to say, as we properly say here in the United States on so many occasions, we're not going to pay any attention to the General Assembly resolution, to deny it legitimacy, not to allow it to delegitimize Israel, but to reject the notion that the General Assembly has any role in the Middle East peace process at all. If you allow yourself to believe pay any attention to it. The second best way to do it is for the United States to repeat its successful strategy in 1989 and to say to the Europeans, to the other countries of the Third World, if you adopt this resolution, there will be consequences, and the consequence will be no funding for the United Nations. Now, I understand from living here in Washington, we have a spending problem in the federal government. Is that right? We have a deficit or something like that, and it contributes to the national debt. How about, as a way to begin to cure that spending problem, taking action against the United Nations if it does something so profoundly wrong as trying to delegitimize Israel? Now, you can bet that the Obama administration is not going to do that. It's not even worth talking to them about, because they prize the United Nations more than they prize the importance to the United States of helping to secure Israel in peace and safety. So what we're going to need here is Congress to pass legislation very much along the lines of what Jim Baker threatened back in 1989. Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, the chairwoman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has already introduced legislation to that effect. Thad McCotter of Michigan, and I think others have as well. This is the kind of legislation that we should pass as soon as we can to make the threat clear to the other 192 members of the United Nations that we're not going to accept an outcome that's based on an illegitimate effort against Israel. That, I think, would take the wind out of the Palestinian sails, as it did over 20 years ago, and force them back to what should be the way to seek peace in the Middle East, which is those direct face-to-face negotiations. And while we're at it, let's get the Obama administration's thumb off the scale on the side of the Palestinians and get back to being an honest broker. That's what America's strategic interest really is. Now, if the only problem that we had in the Middle East was resolving the Palestinian issue, that would be one thing. But in fact, the overall circumstances in the Middle East, just in the past 6 months, have gotten profoundly more dangerous for Israel. Now, we've all read the narrative of the Arab Spring, of unpopular regimes, dictatorial regimes being challenged by the people of various countries around the region. We all support the legitimate aspirations for free and representative governments of the peoples of those nations. How could we do otherwise? That's in our DNA. We believe in freedom. We believe in representative government. That's what we have fought for the entire existence of the United States. It's what Israel was founded on. There's no doubt where our ultimate aspirations are for the people of the Middle East or anywhere else in the world. But we know from long, hard struggle that democracy is not simply holding an election and counting votes. Democracy is a culture. It's a way of life. John Stuart Mill, in his classic essay on representative government, said that to be successful, the people had to be ready to receive representative government, that it was not simply something you could confer by a declaration. Now, this is not a criticism of the people of the Middle East or of the Islamic world more broadly. We have seen across the world that democracy is hard to create. We saw in Europe during the 20th century, Italy slide from being a nascent democracy into the grip of fascism. We saw Germany fail in its efforts at democracy and succumb to Nazism. We can see today in Russia, a country that passed out of an authoritarian government into a democratic system, passing right back out the other side, back into authoritarianism. So this problem of sustaining democracy is not peculiar to the Middle East. And I think it's very important to understand that as we look at what's happening in the Middle East, because there are those who are actively taking advantage of the legitimate aspirations of the people of the region to subvert those aspirations to their own devices. And the potential result is not only not the establishment of representative governments in the countries of the region, but a continuation of authoritarian regimes, this time quite possibly in many cases under the grip of radical theological leaders who have no sympathy for the West and no sympathy for Israel. That's why the risks and dangers for Israel I think are growing. And let's just take a couple of pretty straightforward examples. In the case of Egypt, all of us, I think, in the United States watched with fascination the demonstrations in Tahrir Square in Cairo leading up to the fall of the Mubarak government. And people were optimistic about the potential future for the people of Egypt. And yet, where are we today, just about 6 months after the fall of Mubarak? Number one, the military is still in control. as it has been since it overthrew King Farouk in 1952. One general, Mubarak, is gone, but the military remains the core of the state. And this military, which we have showered with American resources since the Camp David Accords of 1979, this military government has lifted the Egyptian embargo of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It has knit together Hamas and Fatah in a potentially deadly alliance that threatens not only Israel but other governments in the region. This military government in Egypt has recognized the Islamic Revolution of 1979. For the first time, an Egyptian government will have full diplomatic relations with Iran. And this government, this military government in Egypt, has made deals with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which will give the Brotherhood a substantial advantage in elections likely to be held in Egypt by the end of this year. And the candidates who have emerged, many of whom are legitimate Democrats, have all seen the direction that has been taking place. Ayman Noor, a leading Democrat, Amr Moussa, a former Egyptian foreign minister and ambassador to the United States, and others have all said as a major launching point for their presidential campaigns that the Camp David Accords with Israel have to be fundamentally revised. Now, they're not going to say they should be overturned. They're too politically adept at that. They're just going to make a few minor modifications, like lifting the ban on Egyptian heavy military units in the Sinai, thus gutting the principal political and military achievement of the Camp David Accords, the separation of Egyptian military forces from Israel. And that's where the bidding starts. So you can imagine what comes next as the presidential campaign heats up. And the reaction, I think, in Egypt and elsewhere in the region has been to stare in wonderment at what we're doing in Washington as the pillar of American foreign policy and the objective of peace and stability in the region. The Camp David Accord comes under attack. And other Arab governments have watched as Mubarak was essentially thrown under the bus by the Obama administration, the man who largely responsible for Egypt's adhering to the Camp David Accord. Now, let's be clear, Mubarak was no Jeffersonian Democrat. Not at all. But there is a virtue in international politics known as loyalty, or at least there used to be, and other Arab governments in the region, the monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula, the oil and gas producing Arabian Peninsula, look at what we did to Mubarak and say, if that's how the Americans treat their friends, how will we be treated when our time of crisis emerges? Of course, they can also look at the way the Obama administration treats Israel and say, my goodness, if that's the way they treat their friends like Israel, how are they going to treat us in our time of crisis? This is the sort of policy that leads friends and allies of the United States alike to say that we have lost our direction, we have lost our sense of priority, we have lost the strategic vision for how to protect our friends and allies and protect our own interests. Instead, the United States has been engaged in a kinetic military action in Libya for over 4 months that has led to mocking and scorn for the NATO alliance, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. Now, I personally believe that the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi is the right thing to do because he threatened to return to international terrorism and quite possibly to resume his quest for nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. I helped negotiate Gaddafi out of his nuclear weapons program in 2003 and 2004, and I would do it again tomorrow. I would do it again tomorrow knowing what we know today. But that didn't give him a get-out-of-jail-free card forever. And the threat to return to international terrorism made him a danger to the United States and our friends and allies. But what has happened in 4 months? The NATO alliance, the absolute foundation of our security policy in Europe since the beginning of the Cold War, looks like a paper tiger. And that lesson is being learned all over the world. Just last week, the Obama administration welcomed an effort by Russia to mediate between NATO and Gaddafi. What has happened to us when our president has asked Russia to come between our closest allies and our military adversary? This is the sort of policy that undercuts American efforts around the world, and it leads to greater dangers for Israel, which we can see mounting on its borders in Syria, in Lebanon, where the terrorist group Hezbollah now effectively controls the government, as well as being completely rearmed, restocked, resupplied, refinanced from the time of the war with Israel in the summer of 2006. And the countries, the monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula, are desperately worried about the Obama administration's commitment to their stability and to the oil and natural gas that form the foundation of the world's economy and hopefully our economic recovery. And here's where the risks of Palestinian obstructionism and the risks of turmoil in the Middle East come together in what the real source of threat to peace and security is, and that is the Ayatollahs in Tehran. They have been systematically trying to exploit the turmoil in the Arab world to their own advantage. In Egypt, through Hamas, a subsidiary of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, which Iran has financed and armed for years, now with the opportunity, because of the lifting of the blockade between Gaza and Egypt, to finance and arm the Muslim Brotherhood there. Iran, which has attempted to use turmoil in the tiny Arab kingdom of Bahrain, just across the Persian Gulf, right next to Saudi Arabia, to unseat the government there and put in a pro-Tehran government, to intimidate the Arab states of the region, to support terrorists among the Shia population of Iraq, attacking our troops even as they depart, to arm and finance the Taliban extremists in Afghanistan in their campaigns against American and other NATO forces. And most particularly of all, in addition to being for 20 years the world's central banker of international terrorism, the Iranians day by day by day are getting closer to their long-sought objective of deliverable nuclear weapons. And this will be a tragedy for the world that we cannot calculate. The effort to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program has rested for 20 years on diplomacy and then economic sanctions. Let's be absolutely clear. Diplomacy and economic sanctions have failed. The Iranians used diplomacy, particularly for the last 10 years, to buy something they couldn't get for love or money, and that's time. Time is always the most precious asset for the would-be nuclear proliferator. Time is what they critically need to overcome the complex scientific and technological obstacles on the way to achieving deliverable nuclear weapons capability. And Iran is very, very close to that today. Economic sanctions have been tried against Iran, but they've been sporadic. They've been ineffective. They've been evaded. And they are not going to be sufficient now or in the future to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Look at the case of Korea, one of the poorest nations on earth, the most heavily sanctioned nation on earth. It's exploded 2 nuclear devices in the past 5 years. If Iran is determined enough, and it is, sanctions will simply not stop it from achieving that objective. Now, I'm very much afraid that the Obama administration's response to this is that it will say, obviously, we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but basically we can live with it. We can contain and deter Iran as we contained and deterred the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So while it won't be a desirable outcome, and Iran with nuclear weapons is something we can live with, this is fundamentally wrong. The calculus of deterrence that we used during the Cold War deterrence in the Cold War is not something you can just pick up and apply in another circumstance. For the government of Iran today, nuclear weapons are not really a military objective. They are a terrorist objective. They don't need to achieve parity in nuclear capability with the United States like the Soviet Union did. They need only a handful of nuclear weapons to terrorize Israel, to terrorize our Arab friends in the region, and in fact, through their capacity to give nuclear weapons to terrorists to attack us in the United States directly. The minds of the Ayatollahs are not subject to the same logic of deterrence that the Soviets were, and to believe otherwise is simply putting your fate in the hands of religious fanatics. This is not a good idea, ladies and gentlemen. But even if I'm wrong about that, even if Iran could be contained and deterred, it doesn't stop with Iran. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons, Egypt will get nuclear weapons, Turkey will get nuclear weapons, others will as well. So that in a very short period of time, as these things go 5 to 10 years, you could have 6 or 8 nuclear weapon states in the Middle East, every one of which would get up every morning saying, wonder if I should strike first before the other guy strikes me. This is inherently unstable. It's incredibly risky for Israel, for other friendly Arab states. It's not sustainable, and it's not a policy that's in the best interest of the United States. That's why the focus has to be on stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons to begin with. Now, this is going to require some very hard choices. It's not anything the Obama administration has any plans to do anything about. They're still looking, as the President said in his inaugural address, for some Iranian with an outstretched hand that they can negotiate with. Well, good luck with that. And by the way, something the Obama administration has never explained, even if you could find an Iranian leader to sit down and negotiate with, what exactly would you negotiate? What is the acceptable compromise we can reach with Iran? Let me spell it out. The American position is we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. The Iranian position is we want to have nuclear weapons. What's the compromise? Iran has a small nuclear weapons program? Is that the compromise? This is simply not susceptible to diplomatic resolution. What we need is an overthrow of the regime in Tehran sooner rather than later. Now, a lot of people will tell you that the Iranian nuclear weapon issue is a problem for Israel. Well, it is a problem for Israel, but it's not Israel's problem alone. It's the world's problem, and it's particularly the problem for the United States. Solving that problem requires leadership. Where's that leadership going to come from? I'll tell you, it's going to come from people like you. Because you, by gathering here today, you have demonstrated, and by all of your other activity, that you understand the gravity of the threat to Israel, to the United States, to the interest of civilized society around the world. And what we need to do, as only citizens of the United States can do, is stand up and demand that we take back our government and that we assert leadership. it is the case that the most powerful force on earth ultimately is not nuclear weapons. And I stress the most powerful force on earth. The most powerful force on earth is an aroused American public. And I've heard you today. You're aroused. Go to it. Thank you very much.